So we're going to bring up General Levy next, I believe, and he's going to have a conversation on space warfare, the defense of space.
Fantastic.
So you got to meet Lee.
Yep.
Let's see if we can bring General Lee Levy up, who's on our board of advisors and been a huge supporter and a host of this event.
I'm on the net. I don't know if you can see me there,
There
back
he is.
in
Yeah.
the Murray Media Studio, but I'm on the net.
Well, you're up there, and
You are up there.
Your new control center from the moon, right?
Well, I thought since
North
this
Order.
topic is space warfare or the potential of such, we ought to remind ourselves that it's a uniquely human endeavor, and a person in a spacesuit helps center us on that.
Absolutely. I want to thank you for your support this time around, and also the past work that you did with us in October, those events and all the other programs you've been part of. Thought we might speak briefly. I think we're waiting for Paul Szymanski to join us. If he's with us, let's go ahead. But we do have a group of events planned for August and September, culminating the event with General Mattis, General Petraeus, and General McChrystal, a rubber chicken dinner in real time, real people in a room. I don't know if we'll have masks or not at that time, but we'll see. But leading up to that, we're going to continue. There's no reason not to do these virtual events, like you said. They both told me, why throw that out? This is working, and we'll continue to perfect it.
Yeah, it really is. It's amazing how it, we have this pandemic that affects us worldwide, and we think, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? We have to social distance. We can't get together. There's no more gatherings and what have you. But it's amazing what comes out of things like that. And even though this isn't the same as giving someone a handshake or a hug, we still can communicate with each other and share messages, and as we have done all day today and yesterday. So this is great. In general, it's great to see you. You're always so supportive of these efforts. So thank you so much, and great to see that you're strong and safe and staying healthy. Like hopefully, yeah, thumbs up for sure. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, but this it's amazing what comes out of this. So we do these virtual things, and they work out pretty well thus far. And even doing a hybrid where you do a combination of people live in person together, gathered, and then continue to do the virtual like we are right now.
That is our new normal.
Absolutely.
So I don't know if we have Paul with us or not, but if we don't have Paul yet, then I'll ask you a bunch of questions, and you can demonstrate once again your brilliance and your self-effacing.
Well, in that case, it'll be a really short session.
No, it'll be War
Well,
and
he's a
Peace.
comedian. We know that.
Yeah, we'll have you do some stand-up too. That'll be great. So the plan is for you guys to visit about the defense of space. And I know we don't want to talk about that much. We'd really rather not talk about having to execute warfare. But to set this conversation up we're having, if you would, I'd love for you to share a few remarks, your thoughts about that with regard to the kinetic aspect versus really what seems to be more of a focus on cyber warfare, et cetera, right? And hopefully we avoid people actually shooting things out of the air and debris coming down, that sort of stuff. But it's really a two-pronged kind of discussion, right? One is the actual defense of those physical access, but also how people can disrupt us using technology. And I know you've done a lot of work, and especially a lot of work associated with NASA and other organizations. I wonder if you could give your perspective of where you think we're going, and what the likelihood is that we might end up having to have some sort of kinetic conflict in space, and what might help us prevent that sort of thing.
Sure. Thanks for giving me a chance to talk about that. So I guess the first question we ought to collectively ask ourselves is, how do we know we're not already at conflict in space today? So we tend to define conflict, at least through the military lens, as I'll call it maneuver warfare. My thing shoots at your thing, or concepts roughly akin to that. But when you look at gray zone conflict and other forms of hybrid warfare, who's to say that space isn't already contested more so than we might give it credit for? In fact, I would take you back to yesterday's session where Ken Peterman and Lieutenant General John J.T. Thompson and I spent some time together, and we had the opportunity to talk about some things that were going on. And General Thompson brought up some open source things that have talked about some of our adversaries who have maneuver vehicles and some other opportunities to disrupt our space capabilities. But that's at the maneuver end, really, of the spectrum. As you mentioned a minute ago, perhaps it's more on the cyber end or in the economic competition end, or even on a kinetic end that affects our ground control segments, et cetera, before it ever gets to the on-orbit segments. So, but before I go any further, I think I see Paul on the net. So, Paul, thank you for joining us. Are you with us?
Yes, can you hear me?
I've got you 5 by 5, as they say. Welcome. It's great to see you.
You're great. It's great to be here.
Before we get started, now that Paul's with us, Paul, I know a bit about you and your background, but everyone on the network with us today might not be quite as familiar. So if you would indulge me, I won't read all 73 pages of your bio because we only have about 30 minutes, but I would like to touch on a couple of things that I think will help calibrate our listeners with a frame of references to what Paul brings to the conversation. So Paul Szymanski has a BS in physics, mathematics, and logic. Interesting combination, I might add, and a master's in experimental physics from Carnegie Mellon. And he's been doing a military ops research analysis for 46 years in every branch of the military. And he spent the overwhelming majority of his professional life thinking about space doctrine, space warfare theory, policy, strategies, techniques, the whole gamut of conflict. What does that look like in space? And he's done quite a bit of work with our United States Air Force, and now it's a follow-on entity, the Space Force in some cases, such as the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition, the Space and Missile Center. And Paul, I don't know if you saw that we had the SMC commander on yesterday, Lieutenant General J.T. Thompson. And for those who may not know, Paul leads a selective group on LinkedIn on space warfare, to which I've been a member for quite some time, and thoroughly enjoy the dialogue and the contributions. And also, I would be remiss if I didn't say that he supported pretty much every government organization on the planet. That's quite the lengthy list, and he's written quite a bit on the topic of space conflict and space warfare. And I'm sure I left something out, Paul, so for that, I'll just apologize in advance, but welcome.
That's a good synopsis.
Well, how do you take such a distinguished body of accomplishment and sort of stuff it into a few moments? But since our time is short today, I hope you'll indulge me and let me just maybe jump right into some Q&A that'll maybe spark some additional discussion.
Sure.
You might have heard when you came onto the network, we were talking about what is war in space, and my comment back to David was, how do we know we're not already at conflict in space, and what does that look like? Because oftentimes I think with our Western military mindset, we view conflict as typically a kinetic activity. My Rock'em Sock'em robot beats up your Rock'em Sock'em robot. So in your assessment, are we already at conflict in space, even though it may not be above the Earth's atmosphere?
Well, I see it as much like the Cold War, where different adversaries would probe defenses, U-2, maybe overfly, and do all kinds of things like that. And, you go to the CIA and you see a wall, at their headquarters of agents that died in the line of duty. So that's kind of a conflict level. I think the beauty of space is that it's so far away and it's so difficult to directly image and to directly understand what's happening. But in particular, the general population doesn't know what's happening. So I think it adds extra rungs on a conflict escalation ladder in terms of different countries being able to show resolve and intent and communicate directly government to government without people getting all upset. Like, an example is maybe the Falklands War. I'm not sure Great Britain really cared about the Falklands Island, but the populace got all upset, so they had to do something about it. Now, in my estimations, there's been probably 5 or 6 space wars since the 1970s. So yes, there's things happening. There's probes happening. The latest thing that everyone on the block has to have their own inspector satellites. And you can see some indications thereof of getting close, probing. And an inspector satellite can have manipulator arms. It could have all kinds of cyber kinds of things. So yes, I think that's an additional level of conflict. maybe almost like cyber. And certainly we've experienced and seen other countries experience cyber warfare. And that appears to be kind of a constant thing. And I think in some sense, space is getting away with the same sort of probes and, testing the defenses and pushing people around, I guess, is really what it comes down to.
Right. And I think you bring up a great analog, but also a great companion vulnerability with respect to space. And when you couple cyber with it, because it doesn't automatically behave in the domains the way that we typically think of domain warfare. So it requires maybe a more elevated thinking for us in the national security space. To that end, the national security decision-making apparatus, the machine by which we understand the world around us, use it to impose our will or prevent others from imposing their will against us, is, you don't have to like it or not, but I'd say it's fairly refined over many decades of post-Second World War conflict, Cold War, et cetera. But now as we start to see more potential for escalation in space, do you think our national security decision-making structure is positioned properly to, as we say in the aviation business, see and avoid, or see, avoid, and respond to what may be happening in the space domain, certainly before it becomes something more escalatory than it needs to be?
Well, the thing is warfare has been around for tens of thousands of years. We're used to warfare, naval, army conflicts. And then we're, I guess, kind of probing or getting used to the cyber. The space, I would think a good number of our politicians don't really understand it technologically, understand it politically. And in my experience in the space warfare community, they've been very adverse to involving the State Department, let's say, in a lot of these things. And if you're going around maybe developing some sort of weapon system and you refuse to have the politicians involved, and again, the State Department, when it comes time to employ that system, they're the very people who are going to say no. And I've been on a lot of programs most of my career that they spent hundreds of millions of dollars, and then they got to a certain stage and the politicians got cold feet and said, forget about it. So I think it's a little bit more open at the moment, but I think there's a lack of technological understanding. I mean, when people talk about outer space warfare, they think of debris. Well, there's all kinds of ways that you can mess with the satellite, especially if you've got something coming up close and personal. An inspector satellite, you could spray optics or solar panels or, the cyber and pulling something out of orbit, and which, by the way, I guess the French just simulated in one of their exercises. So there's a lot of subtlety that you can do there that probably the politicians aren't aware of. And it's also, you're really not talking about loss of human life in space. Okay, so your machine broke, and I think the other trouble is let's say we're at war in the Western Pacific and one of our satellites break. Well, gee, was that solar flares, a micrometeorite? Well, the electronics, they just break now and again, or was it intentional? And you might say, well, we're having to be at war with China. Maybe they did it, but maybe it's the Russians stirring the pot. In my impression,
the concept of attribution gets called into question.
Sure, and my impression is that the NCA level is not going to do a counterpunch until they know who did it and why. That it's not only who did it, but the intent. Are they trying to just take out some communications? They're doing a decapitation attack against command and control. Is it against our ability to image the battlefield? So I think that we're going to dither on it And, at least think about it for a few days, if not a few weeks. In my simulations show, space war is over with in 24 to 48 hours. So I think in a sense, we will self-deter because we haven't really educated our political leadership, and we will lose because of it.
Well, I don't know that I hoped you'd say any particular answer, but that was sort of what I wanted to tease out, was perhaps that our traditional national security decision-making structures, which move more slowly and do pull in the State Department, albeit maybe not as early as they ought to be. And as a military person, I would always tell you, I don't want to go really anywhere that the State Department hasn't either gone before and or aren't with me at the time, because I think that's really the most effective way from a whole government perspective. But in this 24-hour the war is over notion, your position or your assertion is that our thinking can't turn quickly enough inside of that to analyze and then respond if necessary, or make a decision not to respond one way or the other. Is that a fair statement?
In one sense. Now, in order to, let's say, do a quick and decisive attack on our assets, you have to pre-position certain anti-satellites in key choke points.
Mm-hmm.
And those choke points vary according to the theater of operation and maybe even the conflict level you're in. So there's two ways to optimize an attack. You cannot start maneuvering anywhere in your orbit if you're going against another satellite. There's only discrete parts of the orbit that's allowed in. So you can either have all your ASATs start maneuvering in it for attack at once, but they would hit their targets at different times, or have all your ASATs maneuver at different times to hit all the targets simultaneously. So I think in some sense, a smart adversary, and we have many of them now, is going to try to take out our eyes and ears in space before they do anything on the ground. And if we can detect their preparations for a massed attack in space, maybe we can frustrate the actual conflict on the ground and ultimately save lives. Because, maybe frustrate it militarily, or go to the UN and say, we see they're building up for this attack, and so forth. So those setups for the attack might take days and weeks. So if we had space domain awareness and we really understood it, and again, going back to that intent, what exactly are they trying to do? What is the conflict level? And I think that's part of the beauty of space. Space actually can prevent conflicts on the ground, because there's throughout history, there's so many conflicts that started with misperceptions. And space provides those, the imagery and the signals intelligence, radar, the communications and the missile warning and everything that helps with understanding the situation and what is your adversary doing. So there's less chance of miscalculations, I guess, essentially what I'm saying. So I advocate for a strong military presence in space, because you're really not talking much of any casualties of a war in space. And you could most readily prevent a conflict from even starting on the ground, or stopping it in its tracks. I mean, if an adversary, he loses all its space assets, well, especially if we lose all our space assets, can we really prosecute a faraway battle?
Well, it certainly does change the risk escalation ladder, and it changes the win-loss calculus on both sides. It changes, the operational design of a potential campaign. So it's certainly, or said maybe a different way, I think it's fair to say all modern militaries have become heavily reliant on space in one or many fashions. So to that end, you've written a piece called the Top 40 Rules to Fight and Win the Next Space War. Maybe what would be your number one rule to fight and win the next space war that you would want to share with our listeners?
Well, getting back to the space domain awareness, because space really isn't crowded. There's just a vastness, and you really can't image or understand everything. And you've got so much possibilities that happen. And we lose track of satellites all the time. I mean, the Russians have had satellites that we lost for years that they finally publish something and tell us where they're at, especially highly inclined orbits and
Right.
so forth. So understanding the domain and the threat, and even understanding yourself. See, the trouble is space is purely information. It's generating information and it's transmitting information. So in a sense, it's information war if you're talking about space war. But
Mhm.
what is the value of information on the battlefield? And that's hard to calculate because you're, in a sense, modeling a human mind. If an adversary has the information or not, what does he do? Attack left or right? If you're going against dictatorships, maybe some old codger there in charge doesn't really understand. And if we attack his satellites, he's sort of like, whatever, I don't know. He doesn't understand the value space. How do we even target? Do we understand what's better, to target their imagery satellites or the communications satellites? So there's this whole problem of not only knowing what can hurt you in space, do you even know the value of space to yourself? I mean, we all know it, yeah, it's valuable, but can you measure it? Especially if you've got limited anti-satellites.
Mhm.
Well, I've got 50 potential targets and 10 ASATs. Which one should I take out and when? What is the sequence and all? So that's kind of hard. So this whole SSA, SDA is number one. Number two is maneuverability. That's everything in space. And there's like issues like, well, it's good to have allies. Yeah, that's generally good. Is it good to have allies in space? Well, that sounds good. NATO is getting very serious about war in space and so forth. It's good to have those allies. But let's say you're in the Western Pacific. What are NATO satellites going to do for you? They're not going to be able to maneuver them in time.
No.
You got to kind of fight with what you got. So if you can do some maneuvering in 24 to 48 hours, maybe, but pre-conflict positioning and being able to maneuver a little bit within that region is probably number two. Number three is you can have all the super duper high tech space warfare gear, but if you do not have the political will to use it, then it's worthless. And there's so many occasions in military history where one adversary who was tremendously stronger on paper was defeated by a much smaller force. And I think we're in that kind of psychology today. I've seen it in the leadership where they believe, oh yeah, we have infinite intelligence. We know everything that's happening. What's going to really happen in a space war. And since we haven't had any really major space wars, you're really not sure what's going to come off. And so political will and decisiveness is important. And the other half of that is, I think space is more political than anything else. Unfortunately, we're used to conflict on the ground, and we understand that, and we understand the consequences. But to the average Joe in the street, if he hears we had some major space war, I think he's going to get more upset, and there's going to be all these consequences, and maybe allied realignments after the conflict, both for the red and blue. So it's important that whatever you're doing during the conflict, you better really think it through of how it affects post-conflict. And I don't think anyone's thinking that way.
I think you brought up a point a minute ago, which is one of the key foundational principles of warfare is to hold at risk your adversary's things that he or she values, right? And to your point about, does the leader of that country value his or her space assets and what that represents? Conversely, how much do we value that, and how do we then maneuver politically around that? But I think your point, you sort of reiterated the point, I believe, which is we have to think more crisply and more rapidly about these issues, particularly in execution. What how do you look at, typically we think about centers of gravity, right? That's something that's sort of conditioned to most of us military folks from, maybe moment one in uniform. How do you think about centers of gravity in space? Or do you connect them to terrestrial centers of gravity, or none of the above?
Well, certainly there are some space-related centers of gravity on the ground. I mean, number one is the adversary commander's in the blue commander's mind. What his culture, training, aversion to risk, fears, things like that. There's certainly launch sites on the ground, tracking telemetry and control sites, maybe some weapon launch sites. But in space, you certainly have the geosynchronous orbit, which is kind of fixed in some sense. There's certain probably critical jumping off points for ASAT attacks against, let's say, specific space assets of ours that some probably are not necessarily intuitive. For example, let's say at low Earth orbit, a satellite can be on the other side of the Earth from you, yet be close. Close is defined as the amount of fuel and time it takes to get to you. And if he's in the same inclination and the same altitude, he can just do some phasing attack against you. So it doesn't make much sense in some sense to have a control zone around you. There's this topological thing that you have to understand, but there certainly are choke points. I've developed maps of them, and you could see, if nothing else, if you look at altitude versus inclination, which are the two most important factors for an orbit, and you just plot those on a map of all space objects, you can see concentrations of U.S. assets, red assets, and so forth. And it gives you sort of a situation map. You see, according to where the launch sites are and all, what is considered important. And you could see things like, gee, this is the blue zone. What is this red satellite doing here?
Yeah.
Well, it's not a physical point in
space.
Sesame
Street's one of these things is not like the other. One of these things just doesn't belong.
Yeah, and you could do studies like, the Chinese Badao satellites. It seems like within a 30-day period, they're within 1,000 or 2 kilometers of every one of our GPS satellites. They could be dumping off a space mine as they go around. And they don't look close, but as far as the orbital dynamics are, they're close.
Yeah, close is a relative term. Yeah.
Right, and that's kind of a choke point. Certain orbits like that, and this is easy to mathematically model, I would think, and try to visualize these topologies.
That's a great point. We're almost out of time, sadly. I would love to continue this for the next 6 hours as a minimum, but I would ask you to give me, but just before we hand the mic back to the studio, maybe close us out with 30 seconds on your view of what we should do to train future military leaders to be prepared to operate in this environment, so that we can give the best advice to our political leaders. And then after that, we'll give the mic back to the studio. Well,
one idea I had is go to one of these gaming firms in San Francisco Bay Area, give them a few $1 million and have them put together a space game. And not with aliens and things like, but a fun space game. Give it to the cadets at the Air Force Academy, or maybe soon Space Academy, and have them play this game. And every week, whoever wins, however you define that, the space war, give them $100 prize. $5,000 a year, doesn't matter. All those kids would develop all the space doctrine, strategy, and tactics ever need to know about how to fight space wars. You know how that works with the young people.
Absolutely.
And then, later on, when he's, some young captain in a watch center at 3 a.m. and funny things start happening, he can.
She'll know exactly what to do.
Yeah, he said, "Oh well, Joe Schmo last year got me on that thing. I know what it means." And the trouble is, you got to do a thought experiment. The unclassified numbers, there's 100,000 people working in space in China. Now, you take just 5% of those people, 5,000 people, you put them away for 10 years in some secret classified program, and their main purpose is to fool that poor captain in that watch center at 3 a.m. Now, these 5,000 PhD scientists and engineers against this poor captain right out of college, who do you think is going to win that?
Those aren't Vegas odds I'd want to put.
Yeah, this is what Space War is going to be about, especially since we're really not sure how it's going to come down. But I can sit here and say, oh yeah, I think it's this and that, but you're not really sure. I mean, certainly simulation is where it should go.
Perfect. Well, that's a great way to close out this session with those thoughts, because how we train our next generation of military leader and the advice that they're able to give to our next generation of political leader will certainly affect our republic for many years in the future, for our kids and for our grandkids. So
certainly, if we lose a war in space, we lose on the ground. And then
absolutely.
Again, we'll have realignments and say, oh, we're going to the winning side for that.
Indeed. So thanks for making time for us. Thanks for all that you've done for the nation. I would again remind folks, if you aren't a part of the LinkedIn group that Paul leads, go take a look at that. It'll really stimulate a lot of thinking and conversation. So Paul, thank you very much. We really enjoyed having you today. So back to the Murray Media folks, David, I think Ken Peterman and the Viasat folks are up next, and we really appreciate a chance to have had this past 30 minutes.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul. And I would echo the general's sentiment. Please go out to Paul's LinkedIn website, his LinkedIn page, join up, and you'll be amazed at the information that you see, and you'll learn a lot, and you'll meet a lot of great folks. And Paul, thank you for being here with us, and thanks for sharing your insights.